inaugural lecture on leadership. This marks an important moment for the center. It is somewhat ironic that the profession in this country that produces the most leaders across public and private sectors does so little to actually train them for that role. Leadership development is a $45 billion industry, but law schools have come late to the parade. And very few schools offer courses or extracurricular events like this one that are devoted to helping people think about what really makes a great leader. Part of why we've been successful, I think, despite that lack of education, is because people learn best by examples. And one of our goals in establishing this leadership program was to give you an example. And no one better exemplifies leadership in our profession than Stephen Wright. He's the president and senior counsel of the Stanford Center for Human Rights and has been in his present position since the start of 2006 and has taught at Yale since 1993. The subjects of his litigation, teaching, and writing include capital punishment, legal representation for poor people, conditions and practices in prisons and jail, racial discrimination in the criminal justice system, judicial independence, and sentencing. He's won 2 Supreme Court cases involving racial discrimination in the composition of juries. He's received innumerable awards, including the American Bar Association's Thurgood Marshall Award, the American Civil Liberties Union's Roger Baldwin Medal of Liberty, and the National Legal Aid and Defenders Association Prize. And just on a personal note, as someone who teaches and writes about lawyers as leaders, there's no one in this space that I admire more, and I'm so pleased he's here to start this lecture series.
Deborah is so nice, and you're so nice, and thank you all. You know, Deborah's written a book about this and has analyzed this from top to bottom, stem to stern, whatever you want to say. So I don't know what I'm doing here, except perhaps as an example of somebody who sort of missed the boat on all of those points that she makes in her book. I hope not, but I'm pleased to be here. I've been an admirer of Deborah for I don't know how long. Years ago, we were on an ABA panel together. I've watched her work. I've watched her work with ethics, professionalism, other kinds of things that are so important. She and I both share great interest in one of the places where I think there's a great need for leadership, and that's in the lack of access to the courts for people in both civil and criminal cases. I have spent an awful lot of my life in the law dealing with the absence of adequate representation for poor people accused of crimes, including the death penalty. But as I always say, there's no such thing as a small case. If you're arrested, I won't ask for a show of hands how many have been, but if you've been arrested, you know there are 2 things you want. You want out. That's what you want first and foremost. If you spend any time in the drunk tank at any jail in this country, small or large, you want out. You're afraid, it's dangerous. There are people who clearly are troubled, who are there, and you're all in there together. There's no privacy, and so you want out. Second, you want a lawyer to get you out. And if you're a person of means, you'll probably be out that day. If you're a poor person, you may be in for months before you ever even see a lawyer. And how can we say that we have equal justice under law if we have this complete disparity? And of course, it can ruin your life to be held pre-trial. We had a client of ours who was arrested and couldn't make bond. He took care of his 90-some-odd-year-old mother. His mother literally starved to death while he was being held because he could not make the money bond that was imposed upon him. A very small amount of money, nothing for any of us, but overwhelming for him. Of course, you see cases where people are never convicted of anything, but have their lives ruined. They lose their job, they lose their transportation, they lose everything that they have because they're held in jail for 2, 3 weeks, months, whatever it may be, often being given an opportunity anywhere along the line to plead guilty and get out, but not to plead not guilty. We let the guilty people out, but we keep the guilty people in. Doesn't make a lot of sense. But at any rate, those are the kind of things that we've worried about, that Deborah's worried about, and so I just say that as a preference. I've got a handful of things I want to say, and then I'll answer your questions. We go to 2, Deborah, is that right? So I'll try to talk about half that time and then answer your questions. Of course, why do we look? Deborah points out that lawyers are leaders so much in so many areas of life, and I think one reason, of course, is we look to lawyers because they have knowledge, because they went to Stanford Law School, because theoretically they know something about the law, right? And because they know how the legal system works, and of course the legal system affects every aspect of our society, life and liberty, who has custody of children, whether people are evicted from their home. I mean, every kind of the most fundamental thing that you can think of, somewhere the legal system has some involvement in dealing with that. And so there is a need to work on those kinds of issues, and often you say, well, let's look to the lawyers because after all they have the expertise in this area. The thing I want to add to that, though, is that that's just the first step, I think, because I think what we miss a lot of times is the depth of knowledge that comes with actually doing, with actually being in the trenches, with actually representing clients in these cases, because I see an awful lot of people who seem like they get out of law school, and since you're on law school, I'll sort of put this in the context of law school, and they're ready to be leaders on the first day out. And as the old saying goes, you always like a convert, but you usually don't make them pope the first day, you know? And I think I would just stress, for what it's worth, the value of being in the trenches, in public defender offices, in legal services offices, in public interest operations like ours, where you're actually close to the pain and suffering that's going on, where you're really understanding why it is that people are in this situation. Because if you just read a bunch of, you know, I started out in the coalfields of Appalachia as a legal services lawyer. And after I'd been there for a while, I said, you know, the problem in Appalachia is that everybody has been studied. You can go to the library and there's just books and floors of books about Appalachia. Everybody in Appalachia, every holler in Appalachia has been interviewed by a sociologist or by a medical student or by somebody. And people have written lots of articles about it. It's pretty obvious what the problems were. Complete anarchy. The coal companies ran Appalachia, destroyed the land and the people, and were totally lawless and were not held to account by courts or anything else. I said, everybody's written about Appalachia, everybody's analyzed it, but nobody's done anything about it. And unfortunately, a lot of the people who had gathered and possessed that knowledge were not doing much more excuse me, than putting it out there. And the value of actually going there, of actually seeing just how corrupt the legal system was there, just how corrupt the system generally. I remember trekking up to the hut, actually, that Gracie Sturgill lived in, where they were literally strip mining right up to her front porch, the Blue Diamond Coal Company, and being able to bring a lawsuit for her. It's the first time anybody had ever sued the Blue Diamond Coal Company, because a new legal services office had started in eastern Kentucky that empowered and enabled people. And in terms of leadership, one of the things that I got from that was a tremendous example of leadership. The Appalachian Research and Defense Fund, which was 4 lawyers, basically, in eastern Kentucky. The first director was a man named John Rosenberg, who stayed as director for 30 years and was my first boss. He had been at the Justice Department, and during the time when it took a huge amount of courage to do it, he had gone south to register and to fight the voting rights battles in the South, to register African Americans to vote. It was literally life-threatening kind of work. And he did that for a number of years, and he was highly regarded and highly respected within the Department of Justice. And then he decided that of all the places in the world that he could go, all the opportunities that he had, that the place where he was really needed He said, I just need to go where the people were. I often quote Elie Wiesel, our lives are not our own, they belong to those who need us desperately. He went to Prestonsburg, Kentucky, of all places. There's not a synagogue within miles of Prestonsburg, Kentucky, I will tell you, and they hadn't seen a Jew there, probably ever. And people thought he was a communist. They thought the organization was communist. And yet, well over 30 years later, John Rosenberg was leading an organization that for the first time was giving poor people the power to call into account things like the Blue Diamond Coal Company. The power of people in a little town called David, which was a town owned completely by the coal companies. And the coal companies, you know, the people worked in the coal mines. The store was owned by the coal companies. Everything, if you've ever read about that, you know that it was basically almost like slavery, the condition these people lived in. John helped those people buy their town back. David now is a town in eastern Kentucky that the people living in the houses own the houses they live in, the descendants of these coal miners who were put there at one time. And as he stayed, and as he built a base of knowledge about the region and about the issues, and as people learned that this little small diminutive man, this was not some guy who walked into a room and everybody stopped talking. This was a low-key, sort of self-effacing, but genuine person who just learned so much about the issues and who stayed. I think one of the things I was most impressed with when I worked for John was that he stayed, that he took that knowledge base that he had and he didn't just run off somewhere else with it. I watch my friends and my students now who go in and out of the administrations in Washington. And they'll spend a year at the Justice Department, a year in the White House, a year at Homeland Security, whatever. How do you get anything done in a year or 2 years? I don't understand all these people that quit after 7 years. You know, Arnie Duncan, 7 years as the head of the Department of Education. Why don't you stay the last year? I mean, you know, surely you've learned something in the first 7 that you could apply in the 8th. But there's something else out there. I don't know what it is. Probably money, but I wouldn't say that. But I would guess that. But knowledge, so incredibly valuable in exercising leadership, because John just knew everything about coal mining. He fought, there was a thing called the broad form deed, which basically said if you're Gracie Sturgill, you may own the surface. You may own your yard and the trees and the forest and all that, but the coal company owns the coal underneath the surface. And of course, when you had deep mining, when we were sending people into the deep mines, where they were all getting black lung disease and dying by the time they were 45 or 50 years old, but then we switched to strip mining. And so now the coal companies took the position that we can just come and we can just scrape your top off, and then we can take our machines and we can just dig the coal out of there. Of course, that ruined your property. And John and Applered fought a probably epic battle. I still think it would be a great movie against the broad form deed. And over again, they lost and they lost and they lost, but ultimately they triumphed over the broad form deed, which for a lot of people saved their property so that it could be used for agricultural purposes or harvesting the timber or whatever it was, but that it just couldn't be destroyed willy-nilly by the coal companies. That's leadership. That was putting together teams of people, not just the teams of litigators in the Appalachian Research and Defense Fund in our law office that did it, but all sorts of organizations and so forth in eastern Kentucky. And bringing more and more people into that fight and educating more and more people about it and the complete injustice of it. Of course, it had a tremendous economic power because the coal companies had so much money that no matter what, the courts were always going to rule against John because you know, their bread was buttered by the coal companies. I see the same thing in Alabama today when we have a client who sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, and then a judge who's up for election in a few years and is worried about his staying on that court, overrides the jury and imposes the death penalty because he does not want an ad coming on the television when he runs for re-election saying he didn't impose the death penalty in this horrible case where all these horrible, where whatever this crime was happened. And so the law, and one of the things I think many of us learn depending upon the kind of law we handle, is that the law may be fairly meaningless in a lot of situations, particularly for poor people. That I spoke at a commencement yesterday and I said, everything you've learned in this law school does not mean a thing to people who don't have a lawyer. And of course in civil litigation that's almost everybody. That no matter how dire the situation is, you don't have access to a lawyer unless you have legal services lawyer, 20% of the need covered there. And in criminal courts, very often you get a very bad lawyer, but those are different subjects for a different time. But I think you know, the basis of knowledge, having a knowledge base that you build over some period of time is absolutely critical. That having a team of people that you work with both in your office and outside or your program or whatever it may be and outside. And then I think selflessness. I learned that from John, I guess, and I guess really learned that beforehand because I grew up in the Martin Luther King era in American life, and I think the lessons that Dr. King taught us, or at least the ones he taught me, was that there was nothing more important than ending racism, poverty, materialism, and militarism, and nothing less important than how much money you made doing it. And so if you're willing to do what needs to be done without a great deal of attention to your own personal situation financially as well as recognition and so forth, you're in a position, I think, to do a lot in some of these situations. I'll just interrupt myself and say this here. I've often said, you know, law students are very competitive. And, you know, you get out and you compete, and people compete for these jobs. You compete to get on the law review, you compete for this, that, that. I took a little different tact. I took a job that nobody wanted. Now, I'm going to recommend that to you because let me tell you, it's very hard to get a job that everybody is competing for because only one person can get the job. So if 100 people are competing, that means 99 people ain't going to get it. I don't care how talented they are. I don't care how far off the Richter scale they were on the dean's list or whatever list you have. 99 people aren't going to get it. You apply for a job that nobody wants, that people are literally begging you to take this job because nobody wants it. You got a pretty good shot, you know? And in 1982, some people came to me and they said, we've got this little organization and put together a couple of 3 years ago, fledgling organization that is representing people in death penalty cases, that is representing people in cases challenging conditions in prisons and jails in the South. These are worthy causes. The death penalty had just been upheld by the Supreme Court. Prisons and jails in the South are absolutely barbaric. You can go back and read some of the cases decided back in those times about the conditions in prisons in Arkansas and Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and all the states. I mean, basically, it's a great disgrace, like so many things, on the history of our country. One of the first cases was in Mississippi. Judge Cady decided a case, Gates versus Collier, and it was described that Judge Cady took his minister when he went to inspect the prison. I mean, the guys literally ate out of troughs like animals. The prisoners guarded other prisoners. There was no protection from sexual abuse or physical abuse of any kind. There was a plantation where people worked on the plantation start to finish with prisoners with weapons guarding other prisoners, and they'd shoot them if they made any effort to get away. Judge Cady said after being there that he said something had always told me that something like that was going on, and something in my life had always been in denial that anything that horrific could be going on right here where we live. Of course, a lot of horrific things were going on in Mississippi at that time, and that was one of them. But that was one of the first comprehensive prison and jail conditions cases that tried to do something about the lack of protection, the lack of health care, the lack of food, the lack of just the sort of basic protection of the security of human beings who are caged up in prisons and jails. And so the idea was this organization would deal with these issues, because in the South particularly, the prisons were horrible, the jails were horrible, and there was a real need to deal with it. The only problem was, it was a great idea, and so they organized this organization and hired a couple of 3 lawyers, but they didn't have any money to sustain it. There just simply was no, the sort of, when you take on leadership in one of these situations, you find that there are a lot of little housekeeping things you have to do. You don't just get to go out and argue in the Supreme Court or argue in the trial court or do the other kinds of things that is the leading with litigation that you're doing, but you also have to do some administrative things which become an increasing part of your life and an increasing headache, I might say, in your life. And one of them is raising money. And basically, the organization had been unable to do that. The people that had been there before had been unable to do that. They had abandoned ship. And so the organization was virtually bankrupt. It was bankrupt for all practical purposes, not in a formal sense. They had declared bankruptcy, but they were bankrupt. Take my word for it. I assure you they were bankrupt. And also there were these cases, very important cases, some involving people facing the death penalty, some involving conditions in prisons and jails, and everybody had abandoned. And I went down there and talked to them, and I came back and said to a friend of mine, nobody in their right mind would take this job. This organization is in horrible shape. It's in horrible financial shape. It's got cases that are critical cases, have nobody on them, no lawyers on them. There's nobody there. This is just a, and I said, I can't imagine that anybody would take this job. And my friend Bob Moran said to me, I can't either. So I said, so the question is that a reason to take the job or a reason not to take the job? And finally, we decided it was a reason to take the job. And I said to Bob, I'll go if you'll go. Not a bad tactic to use. And he said, okay. And we loaded up everything we had in a U-Haul van, and we moved to Atlanta, Georgia in 1982, and I've been there ever since. But at the time we took that on, we were pulled in by this notion that there were people who needed us desperately in the South, facing the death penalty and in prison and jails condition. I had a job in Washington. It was a great job. Anybody would love to have it. And I knew if I left, somebody else would take my place who would do just as good a job, maybe better, maybe not quite as good, but certainly it's not going to be any problem. Georgetown Law School and with a public defender there. But I knew nobody was going to take this job in the South. And so we went down and we took it on, and Bob and I shared the responsibilities for it. The other thing that I think is critically important is you've got to surround yourself with good people. One of the things that I find very interesting as I watch other organizations operate is that a lot of people, either because, I don't know why, but I would guess because of insecurity or for whatever, are worried about people who are very smart, very dynamic, whatever. Maybe they feel like, you know, their own authority or whatever may be undermined by it. I've always taken a different approach. Always hire people, I always try to hire people that are smarter than I am because I figure I can benefit from their, from that fact. I don't know how many times Bob would tell me, no, don't do that. Whatever you do, don't do that. You need somebody to tell you that. And you can't get mad at them when they tell you that. You've got to consider it. You may not come around to it for days, but you're going to come around to it eventually, and you're going to say to them, thank you that we did not make that mistake. There's going to be sometimes you're going to say, nope, I'm doing it anyway. But I think having people who are not the least bit afraid to tell you when they think you're wrong is absolutely critical, particularly if you're operating on the high wire that we were operating on in capital cases and prison jail conditions cases. The other thing is we built our organization. Of course, we tried to build it by bringing in people. We didn't have any money at first, so it was Bob and me, one other lawyer, and a secretary. And for a while, that's about all it was. It was just sort of the dance band on the Titanic, sailing out into the ocean to see what we could do. But we found out we could do quite a lot because you probably know this, but I will tell you, lawyers make a difference. And the difference between not having a lawyer, which is the situation and the plight that so many people are in, or having a very bad lawyer, which is the plight that so many people accused of crimes are in, versus having a lawyer who cares and who is going to put everything on the line for that client, who's going to spend the time to talk to the client, to counsel the clients. One of the things I think people don't understand about lawyering is how important counseling people is. My friend Billy Neal Moore was sentenced to death a number of years ago, and when they sentenced him to death, they said, now on such and such a day, you'll be taken and so many volts of electricity, this was back when we electrocuted people, will be run through your body until you're dead. May God have mercy on your soul. Sheriff, take him away. And take him away they did. And the lawyer never bothered to tell Billy that actually there was an automatic appeal by statute in Georgia, so that the date that was set for his execution was just a hypothetical date. It wasn't an actual date when he would be executed, but nobody told him. So he thought, as they came closer and closer to that date, that that was going to be the day he died. And when that day came, every time they opened the door on the cell block, he thought that they were coming to take him to run this electricity through his body and execute him. You can see the value of counseling, of just sitting down with him after that death sentence and saying to him, now, Mr. Moore, here's where you are. There's going to be an appeal. Don't worry, there's not going to be any execution date. Here's all the stages you're going to go through. Here's how long, roughly, each one is going to take. Here's what's going to be done. And basically, you're years away from any possible execution date. And you have all these layers of review and so, but nobody ever told him that. So, I mean, that's obviously pretty fundamental. But I saw the other day where a couple of lawyers in Texas just simply wrote their client a letter. The certiorari was denied in the Supreme Court, and they just wrote their client a letter and said, I'm sorry, the Supreme Court has turned down our petition. There are no other courts to go to. You're going to be executed. At some point, the state will set a date and they'll execute you. We have not done everything we can do for you, and we're out of here, basically. I just can't imagine it. I just can't imagine it, that you would have a client who you'd get a decision that means that that man is a dead man walking. He is going to be put to death by the state of Texas. And in Texas, let me tell you, you are going to be put to death. And that you wouldn't, the minute you got that order, go to the prison, and that you wouldn't sit down face to face, and you wouldn't go over that order, and you wouldn't talk about it, and you wouldn't sit there and answer every single question that this person has until, and talk about ethical responsibilities to our clients beyond what we do in terms of representing them in court, but that counseling function of being there for them and helping them. These are people like dropped into a foreign land. People are speaking a language they don't know. They're given all these acronyms and numbers and, 2254B and all that. They have no idea what any of that means. And so they need somebody who's going to be very patient and very willing. So many of the clients that I represent, like Timothy Foster, the case we have before the Supreme Court right now, is a young man who's intellectually disabled. He's mentally ill. He's schizophrenic. He has a very hard time coping with the world and understanding the world, and there's a great need for people being patient with him and working with him and working through things so he can at least get the best understanding that he can get within the sense of reality and the intellectual abilities that he has. But that is, in his case, we again had a team of people. We did exhaustive investigation. We turned out to find some things in the prosecutor's files which are pretty revealing of their racial biases. We took what seemed like a shot at the moon and filed the Supreme Court, and there actually were a lot of color-coded lists where the blacks were marked, and there were some lists like, you know, definite no's, don't take the 5 blacks. And so we reproduced those in the petition for certiorari, and we sent it up to Washington, and lo and behold, the Supreme Court granted cert in the case. And it may save Tim Foster's life. It may not. We'll see how it comes out. At any rate, that again, you know, I think I was saying about, you know, hiring people smarter than you or not. I see a lot of people where if you are the dean of the law school, if you are the head of the organization, if you're whatever, a lot of the attention is going to revolve around you. And you see organizations where that seems almost to be, you know, to develop a cult of personality, like Chairman Mao or something. And my own view is that what we need to do is to make sure that everybody on the team knows how valuable they are. 2 of the people that are most critical to me and have been throughout my work in the South have been my administrative assistant, who answers the phones and who keeps me up with all the letters and things that I'm getting and everything that's going on, and our office manager, who has been with me now for 20 some odd years, and who brought a great deal of order, calm to our office after difficulties we had managing our finances and other sorts of things. I am immensely grateful to these people. They're not the lawyers in the office, but I paid them, at least for a long time, I paid them the same thing I paid myself, because we paid everybody the same thing. Later, we paid people by how long they had been there. And so they make more than the lawyers in our office. And it's a way of not just saying how much we appreciate what they do and how much we love them and all that. It's a way of showing it by saying, you are so valuable to this organization, we don't want you to ever go anywhere. And you're going to be treated just like the most senior lawyer that we have in this office. Several years ago now, the Death Penalty Focus, which is an organization here in California, and they called me, Mike Farrell, who's the head of it, called me and said, we'd like to give you an award for what the Southern Center has done. Of course, it wasn't for me. It was for what the whole organization had done. And so I said to Julia and to Patricia, these 2 women that I just talked about, I said, we're going to California. And you're going to stay at the Beverly Hills Hilton Hotel. And when we were presented with that award, I took those 2 women on stage with me, and I said, these are the people that make it possible for this organization to do what it does day in and day out. And I think you see in so many organizations and so many law offices particularly, where people in administrative positions are treated very shoddily, they're not paid adequately, they're not respected in the workplace, lots of things like that. And my view about that has always been that's just wrong. It's just wrong to treat people that way, morally, ethically, whatever. But I have found, I will be glad to tell you, that treating those people with respect and lifting them up and thanking them at every opportunity for what they've contributed has had a very positive effect on the fact that I haven't had to replace them and have new people and break in new people who don't know what they're doing and all that. I've had these wonderful 2 women stay with me, as I said, for well over 20 years now, and make my life and what I try to do in the leadership that I provide, facilitating that in ways that I can't begin to say how important that it is. I just say 1 or 2 other things. I think that for John in the program that I was in before, I hope in my shop, what I am trying to do is provide a place where people who are totally committed to what we're about, to our clients first and foremost, and to the issues that we're about, and we've expanded to things like debtors' prisons and private probation and a number of other things that are issues in the criminal justice system, that we're going to bring those people in and we're going to provide for them the best space we can for them to practice their craft and to be a part of this team to move things in the right direction, to uncover injustices that are going on, to file lawsuits that are going to challenge them. They're going to have a responsibility that when Sarah Garrity files a lawsuit, she may have a couple of other lawyers on it. My name doesn't have to be on the lawsuit. I'm not filing the lawsuit because I give everybody independence in terms of, talk to me about it before you file it. Let's go through it and let's talk through the pros and cons of what's going to happen here and what we hope to accomplish. But let that person go forward with it. And the same thing for lots of other people. And to try to just support that, when I was the director for 23 years, and then I became the president and senior counsel, which I still don't know what that means, but it means I'm not the director, I'll tell you that. And it means that I don't have to deal with the administrative and the fundraising part of it, which is two headaches. I was more than happy to leave so that I could spend more time on litigation and teaching. I sort of lost my train of thought. What did I say right before that? I'm sorry.
Don't put me on the spot.
Independence, trusting people to take ownership of their projects.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, that my role in doing the administrative things, thank you so much, Akiva. We can't wait to have you down there in the office so you can help me on these senior moments that I have. My job was to not burden them with any of that. My job was to raise money, organize things in a way that made it possible for them to do their work as well as they could possibly do it. I think that worked out pretty well. And I think if you look at the things we've done and so forth, I think we've had pretty good success doing that. We've never hesitated to ask anybody anything. To look for expertise. When I first got down there and I thought, what in the hell am I doing here? I barely know what I'm doing. In 1982, I was a trial lawyer in Washington. I wasn't a constitutional lawyer. I wasn't a habeas corpus lawyer. I'd never handled a habeas corpus case. I had handled some death penalty, well, I take that back. I had volunteered for some death penalty cases and handled them. But we were in a very deep area, and people's lives were at stake, and people were getting killed. But I identified the NAACP Legal Defense Fund as the foremost flagship operation in the country that was litigating capital cases. And so before long, I got to know everybody up there, so I could call them. I was never embarrassed to call and say, I don't know what the hell I'm doing, or we don't know what the hell to do about this situation. And will you help us? Or the National Prison Project. Now, Al Bronstein, who was passed away here just last year, but for 25 years was the head of the National Prison Project. And I don't know how many times in our prison and jail conditions we went to Al and we went to the people there and said, now we've got this class action issue, and what do we do about it? Again, a lot of organizations very insular, want to feel like they can handle everything. I take exactly the opposite. If there's somebody who knows anything, I want to know what it is they know, and I want them to help me do it. And if they're going to have some training program or so what, I want to show up and be there because I've been a lawyer now for 40 years, and I can't believe how much I learn every day. You'd think by now I learned something. But I am absolutely amazed. I go into Sarah Garrity's office and she tells me about some private probation company that's just screwed somebody, and I'm like, I cannot believe this has happened. And what are we going to do about it? We're going to file a lawsuit. She just put one of them out of business the other day. But all of these things that we keep finding out, keep working on, but reaching out to other people, having, I feel like what I offer after all these years, and the older I got and the more I'd done this, and I'm a sounding board for the lawyers so they can come in and they can talk to me. I'm going to look at their pleadings, I'm going to edit them, I'm going to help them, but I'm going to support them 100% in what they do. If they're in some big hearing or whatever, I'm obviously going to be there. I may not be there at the council table unless they want me. If they want me to be, I will be. If they don't, I'm going to be there to let them know how much support we have. I think one of the great values of being a lawyer that I just throw in here is writing. You learn so much from writing, and you learn so much about arguments and analysis of things because it really forces you to sort of deal with things. Orally, you can kind of brush over, but you can't really brush over them in writing. There's a lot more to be said about that, but I think I have learned so much from the briefs that I've written and so forth on that. Diversity. We've always had an amazingly diverse staff at our office. We've been extraordinarily fortunate. We don't pay hardly any money compared to everybody else in the legal profession. We pay plenty of money compared to what teachers and police officers and people like that make. But we have we have had a great deal of African American lawyers. We have 5, and a little office only has about 12 lawyers. We have 5 African American women in our office. We have other sort of diversity in the office, which I think is critical, particularly with the clientele that we have, which is almost 100% African American, poor people, people who are in prison, death rows in the South, some white people, not many Hispanics in the part of the country we deal in, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and so forth. I hope, the other thing I'd end with just this. I mean, I see people who run offices. Our district attorney in Atlanta is Exhibit A on this, who's a complete micromanager. He has got to control everything that happens in his office. And people hate working for him. And they don't stay very long. And it's a great temptation for good friends of mine who run organizations very similar to mine, are very much like that. I say, you know, what, you're running the Kremlin over there? My view about this, just for what it's worth, as I was saying a moment ago, is that you hire good people, or you include good people in your organization, and you mentor, you nurture, you listen, you support them, but then you give them responsibility to make decisions. And when you got a case, somebody's got to be in charge of a case. We don't operate by committee. That may sound great. We're all going to sing Kumbaya, and we're all going to just talk everything through, and we're going to, you don't reach conclusions that way. A lot of times we're moving at a very quick pace, because we've got somebody who's going to get executed next week if we can't stop that execution. So we don't have a lot of time to fool around. So somebody, whoever it is, whether it's me, whether it's somebody else, somebody's got to make the decision on that. But my own view is that this has worked enormously well. Giving people a lot of responsibility, supporting them, and having them make the choices about it, as opposed to trying to control every single decision that's made, every strategic call in a case, all of those sorts of things. I'll give my advice. You may not agree with my advice. You're welcome to reject it. I want to know why. We'll talk it through. But I'm not going to pull rank, except in an extraordinary situation where I think everybody would think it would be appropriate. In those situations. So with those thoughts, let me answer what questions, Deborah, that you and others here have, in case I haven't said what you wanted me to.
No, it's been great. Let's open it up.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your remarks. It was really fascinating listening to hear you talk. One of the things that struck me was when you were talking about the value of just staying, and I was wondering, especially in the work that you do that is so challenging and where the victories come slowly, they're important, but they come slowly. How have you found the courage to stay? And when people that you work for talk about leaving, what do you say to them?
Well, my reason is simple. Outrage. Because every day, everything that I see going on in these cases just is outrageous. And it's interesting, I'm sort of embarking on an effort now to try to show the role that judges play on denying people lawyers. I've been doing this for a long time, and I've been looking at lawyers for a long time. And I've been litigating ineffective assistance of counsel cases. I've been litigating right to counsel cases. We filed 6 lawsuits, which helped bring about a public defender system in Georgia. We've done a lot of suits since then about that. But I'm increasingly disturbed by the fact that judges are playing such a role in that. And so I am out to try to document that and show that because it's so critical if we're going to change that. So I'm outraged about that. Edith Jones, the Chief Judge of the Fifth Circuit, no longer, but who played a role in denying funds to people and denying compensation to lawyers in death penalty cases. The fact that a lawyer can miss the statute of limitations 3 times in a death penalty case so that the person gets no federal habeas corpus review whatsoever because the lawyer, I'll tell you, you can quibble about how good a lawyer is in trying a case or whatever, but there's no quibbling over filing within the statute of limitations. I mean, that's as basic as it gets. If you can't file within the statute of limitations, you shouldn't be practicing law. And the Texas bar, and I confronted February 2 years ago, the president of the Texas bar, and I said, I want to know why hasn't that lawyer been disbarred? Because you have a duty, the bar has a duty to protect people from incompetent lawyers like that. But the other thing I've said is, I want to know why the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals hasn't done anything. I want to know why the lawyers in Harris County, Texas, continue to appoint that lawyer to cases. And I'll tell you the answer. They know how bad he is. And they're appointing him to cases because they know he's going to lose. And they know that when they give somebody Jerome Godnich as their lawyer, that man is on his way to death row or prison or wherever he's going to go. And I'm going to try to do something about that because there's no question. I mean, the practice that I've been in is there's a lot of hills and valleys. There's a lot of hills and valleys. I've watched a number of people that I worked for, that I loved, that I cared about, and I wore my heart out on their cases, but ultimately I watched the state put them to death. On the other hand, just the other day I had barbecue with a client named Jamie Lee Horton that when I met him, 1982, he was on death row for having shot and killed a district attorney in Macon, Georgia. And so we litigated that case over a long period of time, ultimately got him a new trial by showing that that prosecutor had, in case after case, discriminated against black people. He got a new trial and he got a life sentence, and then about 6 years ago, I guess, I applied on his behalf for parole. Believe it or not, parole is a guy who's under death sentence. He was. He had met this woman. You know, it's always amazing to me when everything just worked out, but it's worked out great. He and Miss Addie have been married now in 6 years that he's been out, and so we go out every so often. He calls me every so often. Great big guy, and always ends the conversation, and a man of few words, I would say, and always ends the conversation with, I love you, man. And I was saying, I love you too, Jimmy. And that's good enough for me. Anybody else? Yes.
Hearing you talk about it, it sounds like the government and the state is typically the adversary to your work. Do you have any advice, comment, or criticism for folks who see their leadership path through government work?
Well, no, the thing I always warn people about, and my students about in government work, is that just know what your responsibilities and what your authority is. Because so many people that my friends and my students and so forth who've gone into U.S. attorneys' offices particularly, but other prosecutorial offices, have found that everything they do has to be approved by a supervisor. And that often they'll have the feeling that this is the right thing to do, but they're not able to do it. Now, there are ways to deal with that, I'm sure, but I think people have to think about that. Everybody thinks, and all my students that are thinking about becoming prosecutors, and everybody at Yale Law School come to me and say, well, don't we need good prosecutors? There's no question we need good prosecutors. We need good people in those government offices. There's no shortage of people looking for those jobs because they're obviously very politically valuable, prestigious. There are a whole lot of other things. But it's quite a bureaucracy. And, you know, I was encouraged. I met with Attorney General Holder right after President Obama took office and talked about the quality of lawyers for poor people accused of crimes and the need for the Justice Department, which has thrown billions of dollars into state law enforcement, state prosecution, state crime labs, and all that. So this system is so far out of balance. I mean, it's like the New York Yankees playing a T-ball team. I mean, that really is what it boils down to. And I said, if you're going to give all this money to a state to set up a federal state drug task force, you need to give money to also, because if they're going to arrest a bunch of people, who's going to defend those people? So you need to make some grant to the state public defender, if it has a public defender, a lot of states don't, to provide lawyers for those people so that, you know, the criminal justice system can identify the guilty and as opposed to the innocent, can sort people out in terms of individual sentencing as opposed to just treat people like a mass, a faceless mass or whatever. He thought that was a great idea, but it never happened. And of course the reason was just a pushback that he got. As a friend of mine said, and I won't say who it was, but a somewhat prominent lawyer in the administration today, but he said to me, let me tell you, he said the Justice Department is crawling with prosecutors. And he said, you know, the pushback on that, we're not going to take money away from building prisons and giving it to law enforcement and sheriffs in St. Charles County, Louisiana, Lake Charles County, Louisiana, and all that. We're just not going to do that. I mean, because if you give the money to the innocent offenders, you're going to take it away. On the 50th anniversary of Gideon versus Wainwright, one of the more embarrassing programs I've ever been to, the Attorney General had a program in which he grandly announced that he was a new initiative on the right to counsel. $5 million. The United States of America. I said, you know what, for Rhode Island? I mean, what good is $5 million going to do? And then we had the unfortunate spectacle of Justice Kagan, who was there, who was asked by the Attorney General, one thing that they talk about a lot in terms of right to counsel, do we want a Cadillac or a Chevy? Everywhere I go, they always say, we don't want a Cadillac now, we just want a Chevy. They never say a Lexus or something. I always say a Cadillac and a Chevy. I don't know why they do. Louisiana, Georgia, everywhere I've been, they say that. And I always think, you know, we're talking about life and liberty here. I mean, why wouldn't we want a Cadillac? I mean, we're talking about killing human beings. We're talking about denying people of their liberty. I mean, I've just seen 4 people exonerated who spent 20 years apiece, over 20 years apiece, in prison, their lives ruined because they were convicted. Darrell Hunt committed suicide after he was exonerated. I mean, why wouldn't we want a Cadillac in this country, as wealthy as we are? Justice Kagan's answer was a Ford Taurus, which I don't know if that betrayed her lack of knowledge of cars or her lack of commitment to the right to counsel, but it was not a good moment, particularly on the 50th anniversary of Gideon versus Wainwright and the right to counsel. Yes?
You mentioned state judges basically wanting to put up on crime for their elections, which I know something I've read about Alabama specifically, where state judges will even more arbitrarily use the death penalty sometimes for white people so they look less racist, which seems like a really bizarre reaction, but it's not like we're going to get rid of the death penalty in Alabama, so doubling down, I guess, makes sense to them. And I was wondering to what extent you see all of these things as being sort of uniquely Southern and somewhat related, especially given that you're in Atlanta and Montgomery, we have the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Justice Initiative. To what extent you see the rest of the country as sort of scapegoating the South or not, or if it's seen as just as urgent in the rest of the country?
Well, I think it's just as urgent in the rest of the country. I mean, you go to Pennsylvania, mid-Pennsylvania, you're in Alabama. You might as well, if you're not in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, you might as well be in Alabama in terms of what's going on in the courts there. One of the saddest cases that I know of lack of lawyering was in right up near Syracuse, New York, where a woman named Jacqueline Winborn was arrested and was held without bond. She had never been arrested before in her life. She could have been released on her personal recognizance, but she had no lawyer. Lawyers make such a difference. If only there was a lawyer there to say, this woman has never been in trouble in her life. She's a member of this community. She's lived here all her life, and she takes her husband to dialysis twice a week. And any judge there would have released her on her personal promise to come back. But she couldn't do that. And she couldn't file a bond review motion. She had no idea how to do it herself. And like our client in Georgia, her husband died. A short time after that, a prisoner legal services program filed a bond motion for her. She was released on her personal promise to come back. And a short time after that, the charges were dismissed. So as I said earlier, she's never convicted of anything. But boy, how much more severely could she have been punished? Or could this man that I talked about be punished? I mean, those are extraordinary situations where a loved one dies because somebody is being held. But it's not at least bit extraordinary that somebody loses their job or loses their home or their means of transportation and all those things. And that happens all over here in California. I mean, there are counties in California that lease out representation of poor people accused of crimes to law firms based on the lowest bid. One law firm in Fresno, I think it was, it said they were the Walmart of criminal representation. I don't think that's fair to Walmart, because I think Walmart does a much better job than these people did. One of the lawyers there, they took his deposition, he said, I resolved 70% of my cases at the first appearance hearing after a 30-second conversation with my clients. That's California. That's not Alabama. That's happening in Alabama too, but that's right here. Of course, you can go to some other counties in California and you get the gold standard, San Diego, and place like that. But so it depends a great deal on where you are, but it's not a southern phenomenon. I think the South may. It is. I mean, there's no question. I mean, there's no other part of the region that polls show think the Civil War came out the wrong way, or that we ought to still fly the Confederate flag, or believe in white supremacy with the extent that we do in the South. I mean, there's no question. I mean, Obama, got something like 18% of the white vote in Alabama. I think he did better in all the other the 49 states. But we have very large African-American population, 30%, most of the states I practice in, sometimes a little more. And so I always say the criminal justice system is a part of society least affected by the by the civil rights movement. We still have a great deal of racism in the system. Some states don't have any racial diversity, so don't have the same issues. Yes?
Don't you think it would be different if you were the prosecutor in Mississippi or Alabama? So don't you think the message should be, we want people like you in a prosecutor's office? I've been a prosecutor for 35 years. I started out as a VISTA volunteer attorney in St. Louis. I was a public defender in St. Charles. And not everyone's like me. I want people...
St. Charles, Louisiana?
No, Missouri.
Oh, okay.
Uh-huh. Dad. So isn't that the message? We want people to do the right thing.
Yes. If you become the prosecutor, do the right thing. That's my message. You are the prosecutor,
no,
right?
I'm just a line. No, I don't want to be a
right.
line, but I'm a line prosecutor.
Right.
So don't you think you should encourage people?
I do, absolutely. I'm not against that in any way. We need conscientious prosecutors. We need honest prosecutors. I mean, Alex Kaczynski, no great liberal by any stretch of the imagination, has said there is an epidemic of prosecutorial misconduct and suppression of exculpatory evidence going on. And it is. He's true. He's right about it. And so we need honest prosecutors. The prosecutor has a duty to reveal evidence that tends to exculpate the defendant. We have case after case, and who knows how many there are, because most of them we never find out about, where that evidence is suppressed and never provided to the defendant. John Thompson came within 2 weeks of being executed in Louisiana. And they had all along a report that showed that the blood sample on the victim's pants was not John Thompson. It wasn't even the same type of blood. They had that the whole time, and they hid that trying to kill John Thompson.
Is this the person who was accused of killing the prosecutor?
No.
So the person who killed the prosecutor, was he guilty? Because, I mean, we have to prosecute someone.
Who was that? I don't know who that was.
Did you talk about someone who you have barbecues with, he got life? And then
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, indeed. Yeah.
So we have to deal with the reality that some people are guilty of heinous crimes.
Oh, lots of people are, yes. There's no question about it. And the question is, we're increasingly going to, well, I don't know if we ever had an adversary system. We're increasingly going to an inquisitional system and increasingly going to a system where the prosecutors have all the power. because of the plea bargain and because of the control over sentencing. I mean, the judges don't have mandatory minimums, sentencing guidelines, and all that. At least in my experience, the judge has been relegated kind of being a clerk, and the prosecutors are the people that really decide what terms people serve or whether they're prosecuted at all the decisions that prosecutors get to make, which is why it's important that good people be making those decisions. Well, yeah, there's no question. There are people who have committed serious crimes. I've represented them for 40 years now. I know them pretty well. But I think the notion of our system is if there's going to be a fight, it ought to be a fair fight. The idea that we're just going to slap somebody with some perfunctory lawyer and run them through the court system. I watch courts where people literally come to court, they meet a lawyer, talk to the lawyer 5, 10, well, like the guy said, 30 seconds. That's I don't ever see 30 seconds. I usually more like 10 to 15 minutes. First time they ever met the lawyer, short time later they plead guilty. The judge sentences them. And that is the entirety of their experience in the criminal justice system. That's all the lawyering they get. That's all the time they're going to be before a judge. And that's one of the times when everybody in the courtroom, the defendant who's pleading guilty, the lawyers, the judge, the people in the audience, the bailiffs, everybody knows the absolute corruption that's going on there. Because they always ask you, are you satisfied with your lawyer? Of course, how would the person know? They met this guy for 5 minutes. How would they know whether they're satisfied with him or not? They have no idea what a lawyer's supposed to do. But there's never been an interview. That's one of the most basic parts of representing a client. There's never been an interview. There's never been an investigation. There's never been any looking into the background of the person, because even if we're going to convict all these people, and we certainly should, and Jimmy Horton certainly ought to have been convicted, because there's no question he was one or two burglars involved in burglarizing a home, and the guy comes home and does what Southern people do, gets out his gun and goes out and shoots at the burglars shoot back. He ends up with a bullet in it. No question. People like that have to go to jail. But we have to know who those people are. As the Supreme Court said, Woodson versus North Carolina, we have to look at the diverse frailties of humankind. We have to give people individualized sentencing. And we can't do that if people don't have a lawyer who knows the individual characteristics of their clients and who are just processing people through the system. That's not lawyering. I can teach high school students to meet them and plead them. You don't need to be a lawyer to do that. So that sort of, but again, the crush of cases coming through the system is so great that often people don't get the individual assistance to which they're entitled to. And what the great challenge is, and what I always ask prosecutors to do, and I say this in my commencement talks, is that no matter what kind of lawyer you are, you inherit this justice system. You have a monopoly on legal services. And with that monopoly, you can get filthy rich, and plenty of people do. But the reason for the monopoly was not so lawyers could get filthy rich. That's been the effect of it, but it's not the purpose of it. The purpose is supposed to be to protect the clients, protect the people from unscrupulous people representing them. Although you won't find many more unscrupulous people than you find in the bar, but that's another point. But with that monopoly comes some responsibility. And it is to make the system work for everybody, to make it work for the poor people, to make access available to the mother. I had a mother called me from Florida. I couldn't do a thing for her except listen to her. But that's a valuable thing to do. And she was losing her son in a child custody battle. It sounded terrible what she told me. I don't know. I didn't have time to investigate it. It's not my area. But what could be worse than a parent losing their child? 15-year-old child who's been living with her his whole life, has a life there with her and her relatives and all that, and he's going to be given to, first of all, a father who lives a long way away, so she's not going to see him much anymore, and secondly, she thought it was unfit, and I don't know the answer to that, but I know she needed a lawyer. I know that she needed a lawyer, and she's not entitled to one, and she didn't get one, and she had her child taken away from her, and I just don't think that's fair. And I don't think that's any way to run a legal system. And I think if we're going to have these procedures available for people, if we're supposed to be resolving disputes, The legal profession has to be the ones that stand up. Robert Kennedy said the poor person accused of a crime has no lobby. The legal profession has to be that lobby. I see so many prosecutors who are fighting against public defender systems and so forth because they want the advantage of having, I mean, in Georgia, that's all the time because you don't want people to be well represented. I mean, it's very hard to get the state that's trying, or the government, whatever it's local or state or federal, that's trying to fine and imprison and kill people, to give them a lawyer for the very purpose of defeating those purposes. I mean, it doesn't make any sense when you think about it. And we've known that in the South for a long time. Give people a really bad lawyer. If you don't know why Texas kills so many people, give people a really bad lawyer trial, run that case through, give them an equally bad, even a worse lawyer, maybe somebody who can't even file within the statute of limitations for their post-conviction review. And you can kill 530 people, as Texas has done. Yeah.
I just have a question, going to the leadership point and thinking about this idea of quality representation. So I lived in New Orleans for a little while, and with the Orleans public defender and Derwin Button choosing to start to refuse cases, I was just curious what your thoughts were on that. Is that like, do you view that as like effective leadership for that office at this point, or given the funding crises, is that the way to fight that and to demand change, or do you think that it should just be continuous representation as much as you can, even if it's just completely overburdened?
No, for those of you that don't know, in Louisiana, of course, going to hell in a handbasket because the last governor was running for president. So he didn't want to raise taxes or anything, so he ran the state into the ground and then left. And now they're trying to dig their way out of it, and they don't have any money to provide lawyers. They cut the indigent defendant budget from $33 million, which was absurdly low, to $12 million. Wow, what a cut. And so Derwin Button, who's a public defender in New Orleans, did the only thing he could do, which was refuse to take cases. He said, we just simply ethically, here's where ethics and professionalism come into play. The Missouri public defenders did this. We cannot ethically, we have an ethical duty to competently represent the people that we represent. So if I take you on as a client, I have an ethical duty to represent you competently and do everything a lawyer ought to do for you. I also have an ethical duty to all the people I already have to represent them competently. And so if I take you, I'm A, not going to be able to help you very much, and B, it's going to detract from what I can do from these other people. I mean, there comes a place where, you know, the camel, you know, where the final leaf is on the, and collapses. And, no, I was consulted about that, and I said there's absolutely nothing you can do. You have to refuse cases. And that's what public defenders have to do, because just taking every case, of course you want to help every person, but at some point, it's just like here in law school, you take 15 credits. I don't know if you have credits here, but you do pretty well. 30? Ooh, a little dicier. 45? Not too good. 60? I mean, at some point you realize it's going to have an impact on quality, right? Grades. Those kind of things. Same thing is true. Representing clients. Yes, sir.
Last question, I think.
Okay. Yeah, we're out of time. I'm sorry.
Back to your point about certain Southern judges implementing the death sentence right around the time of an election. I'm wondering if you know of any correlation between like the time immediately prior to the election and extra, like more death sentences. And if there is some connection there, could there be a potential like equal protection clause? Like if you commit some crime way before an election, you might not get the death sentence, while if you do it right before one, you might have a higher probability.
Real quick, Alabama is the only state that has override. And there's no question that in Alabama, judges override life and impose death much more when they get close to the election. My view is it doesn't matter, because even if you're 4 years out, the judge knows that prosecutor is going to run against him in the next election if he doesn't override in this case, even if it's fairly early in the term. The second thing is prosecutors much more likely to seek death in election years and the year leading up to election years. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. And the problem with litigating it is the way we handle everything in the criminal justice system is we isolate it into that one case. Was this client eligible? Did this client do something for which he or she could have gotten the death penalty? The answer to that says, same thing for McCluskey versus Kemp in the Supreme Court, the racial disparities. These racial disparities, nobody denies the racial disparities. But they say, oh, no, we're not going to look at the big picture. We're not going to look at the racial disparities. We're only going to look at this one case, and you have to prove that the prosecutor in this case intentionally sought the death penalty because, not in spite of or whatever, because of your race. Well, you committed a crime for which you could get the death penalty. So clearly, you're never going to win if that's the standard, and that's what the Supreme Court has basically done. We don't litigate race. Now, North Carolina passed a Racial Justice Act, and they did litigate, and boy, what did they find out? They found out that race was playing a tremendous role in who got the death penalty in North Carolina. And of course, the North Carolina legislature, seeing that race was playing a huge role in who got the death penalty, what did they do? Repeal the Racial Justice Act. So, you know, as we so often do, sweep all the information under the rug so we don't have to do anything about it. All right, thank you all very much.